So my name is Derek Gomes. I assist the Office of Management and Budget with their communication efforts, and we're glad that you could join us today. I'm joined at the front of the room by the Director of Administration, Jim Thorson, the Director of OMB, Brian Daniels, and the State Budget Officer, Joe Odiaga. Momentarily, Brian and Joe will present an overview of the Governor's FY24 budget. The presentation that is projected on the screen, you have hard copies of. If anyone needs one after the briefing, I'll be happy to provide. We do ask that you please hold questions until Brian and Joe finish their formal presentation, and we'll be happy to answer as many questions as you may have. And just a reminder that all of the materials that have been provided before the briefing, during it, and after are embargoed until 4 this afternoon. And with that, I'll introduce Director Thorson.
Thank you, Derek, and good morning, everyone. Congratulations. You qualify as a nerd. Yes, this is the biggest day of the year for us. It's bigger than Christmas for some of us. If we had a Christmas, we might remember Christmas, right, guys?
And no holidays for us.
Yeah. As Derek mentioned, my name is Jim Thorson. I am the Director of the Administration, and I'm pleased that you can join us here today to hear about the Governor's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal. So many of you heard the Governor's State of the State address earlier this week, but in case you did not, I will requote. I'm proud to say that Rhode Island is ready. We're ready to raise incomes for families across our state. We're ready to improve education outcomes for our students. We're ready to build a healthier Rhode Island. And we're ready to ensure that everyone benefits from this work. With $1.2 billion in federal funds flowing into projects across our state, we have an opportunity right now like we've never had before. So raising income for families, improving educational outcomes, and building a healthier Rhode Island, these are the themes of this year's budget. And discussions with the Governor and budget deliberations undertaken over the past few months have anchored on these themes. Almost every discussion we have that comes back into play. So here we are, and we're ready to move forward. The budget proposal presented today provides the details. To some, budget documents might seem like a long list of items for our department and offices, but it is the Governor's specific plan on how to deliver on these priorities to make Rhode Island a better place to live, raise a family, and to do business. It takes an awful lot of work to capture these aspirations and bring them to life in a realistic operating plan. That's where OMB and the Budget Office play a critical role. While the state has dedicated staff and professional management in our department statewide, I believe that no other arm of government here in Rhode Island matches OMB and the Budget Office for its depth of talent. I want to thank staff for their work, especially Brian and Joe, putting in long days with the Governor and his staff to put this proposal together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian, the Director of OMB.
Great. Thank you, Director Thorson. My name is Brian Daniels. I'm the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. I'm going to start off with surplus. So last year about this time, I think I was before many of you and said we have an unprecedented surplus in fiscal year 2022, and I'm here again in fiscal year 2023 saying that we have again a very large surplus. We are projecting about a $610 million surplus in the current fiscal year. This is attributable to a number of factors, including strong revenue collections, even though there are warning signs of a possible recession on the horizon. Rhode Island revenues remain strong, and our economy is still strong, so that's showing up in strong revenues. We have lower expenditures in a number of our agencies, primarily from personnel, Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island is an employer, and like many employers, we are having difficulty retaining, hiring and retaining staff, and so we do have some personnel vacancies that has led to some operating surpluses in some agencies. We also have continued federal support during the pandemic. The federal government extended the 100% FEMA reimbursement through the end of June of last year. We had not budgeted for all of that, so that's additional funds that we received, as well as enhanced federal Medicaid match. So that has been extended to an additional 6.2 percentage points of the federal share of Medicaid. We've been getting that longer than we expected. So these are largely one-time revenues. We're treating them as one-time revenues, and like last year, the governor wants to make sure that we are not creating obligations in the budget that we can't meet in the out years, and so we're focused largely on one-time expenditures for these surplus dollars. So in many cases, just like we said last year, we are looking to invest in areas of improvement. Where have we had long-standing problems in state government? Where have we underinvested? Are there existing problems that we can address through these one-time surplus dollars? Another thing we've tried to do, you hear about it a few times today, is can we do anything to bend the cost curve? Can we reduce the cost of operations in out years? So that way, if we reduce spending on things like debt service, that it gives us more flexibility going forward. The governor spoke about a number of different items in his State of the State address. One of the things he was very keen on, as you heard, is education. And he's talked about achieving Massachusetts educational attainment by 2030. So one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to education spending is that in the last 3 years during the pandemic, there have been some enrollment losses. People have gone to different schools, people have left the state, and the net impact of that is about a loss of 5,700 students across all public schools since prior to the pandemic. If we were to bring back the K-12 education funding formula right now, after holding communities harmless for 3 years for that enrollment loss, traditional public schools would lose $30 million based on that enrollment loss. So we had to think about how do we stop paying for empty seats and really start targeting our education dollars to what it's supposed to be intended for in the funding formula, so that we actually invest in students, we improve educational outcomes, we focus on the students with greatest need, the districts with greatest need. So the governor proposed a number of different items to address that in the funding formula. The first item is increasing the student success factor. This is the additional amount that districts receive if there is a student, an economically disadvantaged student, a student in poverty. Right now, they're getting 40% of the core instructional amount in increase. They're getting that 40% increase. We are proposing increasing that to 42%. Another challenge that we've heard from districts is that when a child exits a traditional public school to a charter school, because of the way our funding formula works, money follows the student, and then they lose the money right away. So Massachusetts has addressed this issue. So we looked to our neighbors to the north and said, how do they handle this? And Massachusetts has a transitional fund where they phase out the support to the sending district over 3 years. We're proposing doing the same thing for 2 years. So for the first year, a sending district would get 60% of the cost of that student. In the second year, they would get 30% of the cost of the student. And in the last year, it would go down to zero. The reason that matters is that in many cases, when you lose that student, you can't get rid of 1/20th of a teacher or 1/20th of a classroom. So it gives schools an opportunity to address that in the longer term, make adjustments that they need in staffing and in operations to address those costs on a longer term basis. The governor also has, consistent with the goal of improving educational outcomes, fully funding the multilingual learner and high-cost special education categoricals. Those are existing additional funds that are available to districts to meet the needs of those students. We have not fully funded those in the past. The governor has proposed increasing those and fully funding them to the tune of $13 million. There's also a proposal to increase the to provide $2.5 million for students experiencing homelessness so districts have additional dollars to provide the services and supports needed for that specific population. So after those first 4 items, what we do is say, all right, if any district is still losing money based on what they had in fiscal year 2023, we are offering a one-time 50% payment for the difference between those 2 years, between what they got in 23 and what they would get in fiscal year 24 under the new assumptions. In some cases, districts had substantial enrollment losses and are not fully made whole by some of these factors. So we're providing a one-time 50% payment for that difference, and that's to the tune of $8.5 million. And again, that would just be one time. When it comes to higher education, the governor is focused on higher education as a way of improving our workforce and raising per capita incomes. The overall budget increases the commitment to higher education by 6.8%, so that's $14.2 million to Rhode Island College, University of Rhode Island, and CCRI. So what this does is this increases their base appropriation, their unrestricted appropriation, and we also fund some specific initiatives that the institutions put forward. For example, Rhode Island College has, last year the General Assembly created an applied biology and biosciences certificate program. This funds that program. University of Rhode Island has focused a great deal on blue economy, as you are aware, with their Narragansett Bay campus. So we're providing $1.5 million for blue economy research and faculty to support some of the infrastructure improvements that we're making. And CCRI has 2 initiatives that would be just under $1 million. One is providing financial coaching to students, and the other is community engagement. So CCRI would actually go into communities. They've looked at South Providence as an area where they can actually go and meet students and actually teach classes there so that they don't necessarily have to go to the institution. It's a way of engaging with the community and getting people enrolled. A couple of other education-related items in addition to CCRI's initiative there that I just mentioned. They have proposed a Fresh Start Scholarship. This is $2.5 million in one-time funds. And the goal for this is to re-enroll students who had started at CCRI and who exited. The problem is once they exit, they are no longer eligible for federal education programs like Pell Grants. And Pell Grants largely cover the cost of CCRI, but they're not eligible to do that. So CCRI has proposed a $2.5 million initiative to re-enroll 1,000 students for 1 semester, which would then make them eligible for federal aid going forward. The governor's also proposing in the Office of Post-Secondary Commissioner, Rhode Island Reconnect. So this is not just in higher ed, but also in career and technical, any type of work certifications. The Office of Post-Secondary Commissioner would work with, have counselors to work with individuals to find out, do they need additional services or supports that are preventing them from attaining educational outcomes or attaining certifications or attaining degrees, whether that's childcare, transportation, access to benefits. So this is a way of providing those supports to people to make sure that they complete their certifications and their degree programs. And finally, at the end of December, the Department of Education put out a report. It was requested by the legislature about how we would attain 5,000 pre-kindergarten seats by 2028. The governor's budget includes some components that were recommended in that report. Notably, we have 800 seats, pre-K seats, that are currently funded by a federal grant that is expiring. We do not want to lose those 800 seats, so the governor is proposing $7 million to make sure that we continue those seats. Additionally, the governor's budget includes $1.3 million to prepare 35 new classrooms for the 2024-25 school year. It's about, I think, 18 to 20 students a classroom, so it's about 600 students that would be ready to go into pre-K in the 24-25 school year. On tax relief, the governor talked a fair amount about tax relief and the sales tax in his State of the State. One of the things he's really focusing on is how do we compare with our neighbors. This is very important to us from an economic development standpoint, but also for Rhode Island families. It's not fair for businesses if our tax rates and individuals if our tax rates are far beyond what our neighbors have. So we took a hard look at some of the key taxes and fees that businesses and Rhode Islanders pay, and the first is sales tax. Rhode Island has the highest state sales tax rate in New England. It is tied for the second highest state sales tax rate in the country at 7%. As you see on the screen, our neighbors, Connecticut is 6.35% and Massachusetts is 6.25%. One thing that's important to realize is that about 1/3 of Rhode Islanders live within 3 miles of the Massachusetts or Connecticut border. So people have options as to where they spend their money. It's not fair for businesses if Rhode Islanders are leaving to go to Massachusetts or Connecticut to save money on sales tax. So we want to be more competitive. So the governor is proposing an incremental approach to reducing the sales tax. He's proposing in the first year 6.85%. We do not have an out-year schedule. It is going to be contingent upon what our budget outlook is each year. But the goal is that we continue to keep chipping away at this year after year. If we were to continue at this pace, for example, going down 0.15% each year, we would match Massachusetts in 5 years. Again, we'll talk more about the budget outlook at the end, but the goal is making sure that we're making progress and that we don't stand out as the second highest sales tax rate. If we go to 6, just going from 7 to 6.85 moves us from tied to second to 7th in the country when it comes to state sales tax. Additional tax relief, the governor mentioned that our gas tax is indexed for inflation, and because inflation has been high in recent years, without action, the gas tax would increase on July 1st of 2023 from 35 cents to 38 cents. And even though gas prices are down, it is not time to have taxpayers pay more for gas. So the governor is proposing canceling that and backfilling the lost revenue of about $25 million. This would make sure that we have the revenue available for transportation projects, but we'll be doing that with general revenue through surplus funds, through one-time surplus funds until the gas prices come down. Additionally, we have gross receipts tax on electricity and natural gas bills. When you pay your electricity bill, you will see there's a 4% gross receipts tax that you're charged. On gas bills, it's 3%. In light of the fact that our winter rates are higher this year than we've experienced in recent winters, the governor has proposed rebating that for 4 of the 6 winter months. We need standalone legislation to do that, so the governor will be proposing legislation, and hopefully the General Assembly will move quickly on that. That provides about $35 million in tax relief to residents and businesses. From the corporate minimum tax perspective, we have again, last year the governor proposed decreasing the corporate minimum tax from $400 to $375. That was not accepted. He's doing that again. And this is an area where we are more competitive than Massachusetts. Massachusetts corporate minimum is $456, but Connecticut's is $250. So if we reduce it from $400 to $375, we will provide about $1 million in fiscal year 24 and $2 million in fiscal year 25 to about 71,000 corporate minimum filers. That's the estimate of how many people from the Division of Taxation as to how many people file the corporate minimum. So that would be small tax relief, but it is spread across many people. And last year, the governor proposed exempting the trade-in value of motorcycles. So the way it works right now, if you have a passenger, previously if you had a passenger vehicle and you traded in at the dealership, the amount of that trade-in value was exempt from sales tax. That was not the case for motorcycles or passenger or trucks. Last year, the governor successfully advocated to exempt motorcycles from that trade-in value of sales tax, and he's proposing the same for trucks this year. And with this, I will turn it over to Joe Odiaga, the State Budget Officer.
Thanks, Brian. I will take you through some of the governor's investments in transportation and some others that we're calling fiscal responsibility. That's the pre-funding of known obligations, the paying off of some existing obligations, and some investments that are targeted to improve the state's fiscal outlook going forward. So first, with respect to transportation, this is the second year now that we're making a considerable appropriation of surplus general revenue through RICAP to support state match. The additional funds that the state received from the IIJA were a great opportunity for the state to accelerate the transportation infrastructure work that was already in flight, if you will. However, it came at a cost. We leveraged federal funds to a great degree on our highway transportation infrastructure. It's a very favorable match, 1 to 4 for every dollar of state general revenue. We're typically matched by $4 of federal funds. So it's an opportunity that we don't want to pass up. Last year, we followed the general approach of staying about 2 years ahead of it, and we're keeping that up this year. There's $182.4 million being transferred into transportation funds through RICAP, and that falls into more or less 3 buckets. As Brian mentioned, we're canceling the proposed increase to the gas tax. The gas tax is one of the state's major funding sources for transportation infrastructure. So pre-funding that tax cut, if you will, of 3 cents, or the canceled increase, costs about $24.6 million for 24 and 25. So you could think of $24.6 million of the $182.4 representing tax relief. The other 2 components shown here are $87.8 million ensures that we have adequate funding in RICAP to meet our state match needs through fiscal 25. So we are remaining on top of this known obligation. And then secondly, $70 million of that amount represents what's necessary to keep critical infrastructure work moving amidst the fact that due to the federal court decision, state tolling operations have ceased. So that is backfilling toll revenues both in the current year and next year. So in 23 and 24, about $70 million between the 2 years to ensure that while that legal matter plays out, that state highway construction projects can continue. And additionally, while that supports our highways, our biggest roads and bridges, our state-managed infrastructure, the governor wanted to be sure that we were also investing funds into local roads, sidewalks, potholes. That was something that he appreciated and emphasized was a nuisance to many Rhode Islanders and somewhere where we lag behind. He's proposing $20 million of state fiscal recovery funds for a matching fund. This will require a local match. It'll be administered through the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and it will be to fund local road projects, whether that be repaving projects, sidewalks, and potholes, administered by the Infrastructure Bank, with the construction projects managed by the municipalities themselves. Another notable one-time contribution in this budget is $55 million to add an additional percentage point to the state rainy day fund. Right now, the statutory and constitutionally defined rainy day fund has 5% of state general revenues, and with any remainder at the end of the year flowing into our pay-as-you-go capital fund. 5%, I'll say in conversations with ratings agencies when looking at national rankings, it's not what it used to be, 5%. I think when that was established, it was a very positive step in the right direction. At this point, while Rhode Island is not at the bottom of the league tables with respect to rainy day fund, and I think that we have a lot to be proud of in the fact that it's constitutionally established and we've maintained a solid commitment to our 5%, we do lag behind our peers. Not that there's a one-size-fits-all rainy day fund number, but Massachusetts and Connecticut set statutory targets of as high as 15%, and we're only at 5%. The governor wants to ensure that critical investments in good times and bad, we're able to see it through the tough times. Over the past several decades, we've had to turn to unconventional places where we don't want to turn to when we've faced challenges that our rainy day fund was not sufficient to weather. So, for example, decades ago, something we addressed in last year's budget was the deferral of pension contributions. Also, the 1999 motor vehicle excise tax phase-out was something that had to be reversed during a cyclical downturn in the economy. By investing more into the state's rainy day fund, it ensures that in the inevitable ups and downs of the business cycle, the state will not have to pull the plug on commitments that have been made in prior budgets. And finally, some other fiscal responsibility items, pre-funding known commitments. Last year, the Clean and Drinking Water Program is a program that we receive recurring funding for from the federal government and requires a state match. The IIJA increased the amount of funding that flowed into the Clean and Drinking Water funds. This is the program administered by the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank with support of DEM and RIDO. Last year, we pre-funded the known match for about 2 years. This year, we're funding it through fiscal 2028. In recent ballot initiatives, ballot referenda, this has been something that we've borrowed GO funds for. So not only is this ensuring that we can continue to leverage this federal funding opportunity, but it's also potentially keeping an expensive item off the ballot and paying for it with surplus while we have it. Additionally, for the past couple of years, we've made some significant contributions to the state's pay-as-you-go capital fund, RICAP as we call it. This year, we are once again making an additional contribution, a supplemental contribution above the statutory amount to RICAP. This enables us to accommodate some of the cost escalations that have happened on projects throughout government. Rhode Island and the construction industry is obviously not immune to inflation, but it also allows for some transformative investments that might not otherwise have been possible. For example, a $35 million investment in a wing renovation at Davies School, increases for the State House renovation project, and also $7.5 million of capital funds for state-owned group homes. That includes some one-time funds to begin some critical renovations, as well as increases in the base that ensure that we have capital maintenance funds going forward. And finally, the governor sets aside $35 million to retire existing debt. We have various options on debt that is becoming callable in the next 2 years, and this could result in as much savings as $4.5 million in the out years in avoided debt service on debt that is already outstanding and coming due. With that, I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thank you, Joe. The governor, as I mentioned before, has spoken numerous times about his goal of increasing per capita incomes for all Rhode Islanders in all 39 cities and towns. So his budget makes some investments, both in one-time dollars and in the operating budget, to make that a reality. On the next slide, these are a number of items, many of which go through the Office of Commerce and the Commerce Corporation. These are some of the economic development and small business incentive programs that they administer. Last year, you may be familiar with the Wavemaker Fellowship. This is the program that was established several years ago that provides loan forgiveness for recent graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics professions. So that was established as we have graduates from STEM fields that they have, and they get jobs in Rhode Island, that they have some loan forgiveness. Last year, the governor proposed and the General Assembly accepted an expansion of that program into healthcare workers. The General Assembly also added it to include mental health workers. The governor is proposing a further expansion of the Wavemaker Fellowship and providing funding for a cohort of teachers. We know that there's a great teacher need in our schools, so this hopefully will provide additional support for people in the teaching profession. The governor proposes an additional $2.6 million for Small Business Assistance Program. This is a loan and technical support program, more micro loans to very small businesses to provide assistance, particularly in early stages or as a small business is expanding. One thing that's notable about this program that in the loans that have been made in the past, about 50% of these loans have gone to women and minority-owned businesses. So this is particularly important, not only from a small business perspective, but also from an equity perspective. The governor proposes an increase of $700,000 from $300,000 to $1 million for Supply RI. This is an initiative that helps Commerce connect businesses with anchor institutions or businesses. So if you have large businesses or higher educational institutions, it connects small businesses if they're in the supply chain or they can provide support to those institutions, then this is additional funds to help make those connections and build those relationships. The governor spoke in his State of the State of the litter permit. This is something that Commerce flagged for us, and the more we dug into it, the more we realized this was not something that we thought the state of Rhode Island should be doing. Small businesses, retail establishments of food and beverage that have takeout service are required to do a litter permit fee, a litter permit renewal every August 1st. That does not align with a sales tax permit, so there are two different permits that they have to apply for. Also, the litter fee is based on their revenues. They're relatively small dollar. We receive less than $1 million from this. It's largely a nuisance. It's a nuisance tax, and also we found out that the money goes into general revenue and is not actually used for litter cleanup. So the governor is proposing removing the litter permit entirely and using $100,000 of general revenue to do a statewide anti-litter campaign spearheaded by the First Lady. The last two items are ones that have been important to our economic development initiatives and incentive programs through Commerce. The first is Rebuild Rhode Island. This would increase the cap from $210 million to $225 million. We would actually pre-fund that obligation with surplus. So this is a program where eventually these credits can be redeemed. We're actually pre-funding that obligation on the front end, so there's no impact to the out-year operating budget. And then secondly, providing $20 million to the First Wave Closing Fund. This is one of the most flexible economic development tools we have as projects are nearing the end. There's additional funds that they need to close the deal. That's where we turn to First Wave. The governor's proposing $20 million for that. A few items on State Fiscal Recovery Fund. As some of you are aware, we had two proposals in the budget last year in state fiscal recovery funds related to economic development. One was $70 million for blue economy, one was $30 million for biosciences. When the General Assembly passed the budget last year, they did provide funding for those projects, but they were contingent upon the state receiving an award from the U.S. Department of Commerce's EDA Build Back Better Challenge grant. Although those projects made it through the first round, the planning phase, they were not selected for the second round. So the Commerce Office took a look at ways that we could reprogram some of those funds. One of them is increasing the amount of biosciences from $30 million to $45 million. This is consistent with recommendations from a recent report from the Rhode Island Foundation about how we can invest in life sciences. $20 million of that is to build out wet lab space. That is something that bioscience startups recognize that we do not have in the state. We do not have that capacity, which is why people have to go to Massachusetts. And also a $20 million fund to help capitalize and build out, support businesses in this area, including workforce development. Another proposal in economic development is related to South Key Marine Terminal. This is a new project, an ongoing project in East Providence to transform some of the waterfront area into a port that would support offshore wind development. The budget included $30 million for phase one of that project. We have additional details about the project for phase two, additional build out. So the governor is proposing another $25 million to support phase two of that. Between the investments made at South Key and the work at Quonset, we hope that this positions Rhode Island well for making us a player when it comes to offshore wind. And finally, a $5 million increase in small business assistance, particularly capital improvements to energy efficiency. There is a program in the budget right now that provides assistance to businesses for ventilation and other types of public health capital improvements. As Commerce went out and worked with its stakeholders, they said, we're happy to take funds for that, but we also need assistance for energy efficiency, given the challenges that they're facing with energy costs. So the governor's budget includes $5 million to expand that program to include energy efficiency. One note, actually I should just go back on one flag on this. Joe will, at the end of the budget, will talk through the fiscal year 23 and 24 numbers. One thing that you will notice is that the fiscal year 24 in federal dollars is higher than it was projected last year. One of the reasons for that, when we did the budget last year, we had programmed the state fiscal recovery funds, the $1.1 billion in state fiscal recovery funds over multiple fiscal years. We've known that Treasury says, U.S. Department of Treasury, we need to obligate those funds by December 31st of 2024, and we need to spend them by December 31st of 2026. Because we had budgeted things in the out years, we thought that that qualified for obligation. We have learned that that is not the case, and in many cases, if it's a state agency, it needs to be contracted. So to make sure that we get the dollars out the door and we don't risk losing them, or if we not complying with the December 31st, 2024 deadline, we are moving all the state fiscal recovery fund dollars that were in 25 and beyond into 2024. Just wanted to see that, so as you start to look at the numbers and see why things have changed, that's one of the factors there. On housing, I'm sure this group is aware, there is the General Assembly created the Department of Housing. That was effective January 1st of 2023. The governor's budget includes 21 FTEs to build out that department on top of the existing positions that are already in the Office of Housing and Community Development and the 4 FTEs that were provided last year. This will expand capacity and allow them to do things such as dealing with housing supports and homelessness that are not necessarily coordinated through state agencies right now. So we're building out that capacity and filling gaps. This is also the organization that will be charged with overseeing the $250 million of state fiscal recovery fund for housing initiatives at all income levels. The governor is also proposing a $30 million investment of state fiscal recovery funds to expand shelter capacity and provide services and support to people who are experiencing homelessness. We've seen recently that in many cases we don't necessarily have the capacity that we need, the shelter beds that we need. We need to invest in that to make sure that we have at least a temporary solution as we try to find permanent supportive housing for those individuals. And then finally, Joe alluded to some of this. The governor pointed out in his State of the State that in addition to the operating budget, we have a very substantial capital budget. Last year, because of surplus dollars, the governor and the General Assembly directed another $478 million in operating surplus into capital projects. And those funds will flow through in the next few years. It's about nearly $2 billion that will flow through the capital plan in the next 5 years. It's 137 projects. Joe talked about some of the investments that the governor's proposing for this year as well. So an additional $60 million for Davies Career and Technical School, improvements to the State House, and group homes, as he mentioned. The governor spoke about improving health outcomes, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the investments here. Most notably, Department of Health continues its COVID-19 response. It may not necessarily be in the headlines, but the Department of Health is working every day to track cases, provide additional support to people who need assistance, and they're largely funding that right now through some of their federal grants. They have not been using any of the $186 million, or almost $187 million that's been set aside in contingency. They have existing federal grants that they're using to conduct those operations. Those grants will run out, and so when we reach fiscal year 2024, we're putting about $35 million in state fiscal recovery fund. We're shifting from the contingency fund directly into the Department of Health's budget to support those ongoing operations. And based on what we've been seeing so far, we have a very large contingency. We don't think that full 187 will be spent down, so we are reserving $61 million of that contingency for ongoing concerns. If for any reason there is a new variant, it requires us to put up new vaccination clinics or testing clinics, that $61 million would support those operations as well as any impacts on state agencies such as the hospital, the vet's home, and so forth. That allows us to reprogram dollars into a few of the things that we had talked about previously. On health initiatives, the governor had indicated that he was going to include provisions for the Equality in Abortion Coverage Act. This is currently individuals on Medicaid and state employees are prohibited from having abortion coverage as part of their insurance. This would provide that coverage to Medicaid recipients and to state employees. A key component of last year's budget was a $30 million investment in certified community behavioral health clinics. So we have currently mental health centers, and what we've talked about doing is expanding them, increasing their capacity, increasing their support and services, so that people with mental health challenges and substance use disorder challenges can get the services that they need. So we set aside $30 million last year so that the mental health centers can improve, build up their infrastructure, build up their staffing capacity, do the many things that are required federally to be a certified community behavioral health clinic. We expect that those will start coming online in February of 2024. So we are setting aside $7.5 million in state funds to provide the rates. We will have higher rates for CCBHCs, recognizing the additional levels of support that they need to provide. This is a really key component when it comes to health outcomes. A CCBHC has a lot of requirements, as I mentioned, with the federal government, including engaging with primary care physicians. So if someone comes in, the CCBHC needs to work with a primary care physician, understand the medical needs of that person as well, the physical health needs of that person, so they get a comprehensive approach to their treatment. It also requires engaging with local hospitals and emergency departments to assist with diversions. If someone presents at a hospital with a psychiatric or substance use issue, substance use problem, then they can work with the CCBHCs to make sure that that they get the services they need. That will also ultimately provide better health outcomes and reduce the toll on emergency departments. And finally, we have the 988 hotline. This was a federal mandate that required somebody calls 988 if they have mental health challenges that they need assistance with. They can call 988 and be connected with a provider. This is also ties into a lot of the work we've talked about in behavioral health, last year's mental health report as well, all part of a plan to make sure that people can make their needs known and be matched to providers. So we provided provided last year funds in state fiscal recovery to run this 988 hotline. We are proposing another $1.6 million in state fiscal recovery funds to continue it in the next year as we find a long-term funding source. And I will turn it back to Joe.
And before we wrap up, I'll go through some of the financial facts and figures and try not to bore you too much with numbers, and remind you that all of the technical documentation for the budget will be available at 4 p.m. I'll try to give a high-level overview of what to expect in terms of the dollars and cents in the budget, and then we'll break for any questions. So first of all, taking a look at the enacted budget and revised budget in the current year and our proposed budget next year, you'll notice that there are upward revisions to the revised budget and additional funds next year as well. As Brian alluded to at the beginning of this conversation, that's driven by the surplus, by increased revenue estimates, and some of the factors driving that surplus are the fact that filled position counts remain below historical levels, and that we have continued financial support from the federal government in areas such as Medicaid match and FEMA reimbursement for emergency expenses. But the governor realized that some of this exceptional revenue performance in particular may not be permanent or recurring, so he made an effort to devote as much as possible of both the 23 and 24 budget to one-time initiatives. On the next slide, you'll see some of those one-time initiatives totaling $522 million across both years, and they're grouped into a few different categories. One that we've talked about already is that funding known commitments, whether that's pre-funding future commitments or paying off existing liabilities. That can include items like the transportation state match, the toll revenue backfill, let's say the retirement of existing debt. Another category are some one-time investments in IT and infrastructure needs. That could include the RICAP transfer and transfers to IT funds to fund some continued work on major IT infrastructure. And then others are some one-time tax relief items. That could include supplemental funding for the workers' compensation fund to avoid a rate increase, or the winter tax relief on utility taxes. On the next slide, This, I think, provides some important context about where we stand on filled FTEs statewide and helps to inform our approach to the personnel budget this year. As you can see, the state has recovered significantly since the low point, the really historical low point that it faced in the middle of the pandemic, but only recovered somewhat. So we've not yet approached the pre-pandemic high, though we have come hundreds of employees from where we were at the bottom. And that presence is felt throughout government. It's also made us consider our personnel budget carefully this year, that we pushed when we could, when an agency needed a new position, to try to fill that within the existing authorization, given that many agencies are facing some significant turnover and vacancy. On the next slide, it summarizes some of the new FTE adds. And you can see that it's a net add of 136 positions across state government, kind of in a few groups. So the Department of Corrections, while we are proposing that there will be 3 CO classes next year of 50 officers each, that we're largely assuming is backfilling coming retirements. The addition of 32 positions is to address the behavioral management unit, addressing the needs of inmates with serious and persistent mental illness. So it provides an additional 28 COs and 4 civilian staff to fully staff that unit. Additionally, we have a few groups of largely federally funded FTE that include the additions at RIDO that help to ensure that some of their critical ongoing grant-funded work can be handled by long-term state employees who understand the needs of the department and the needs of the state, rather than what often happens is the case when the authorization is inadequate. That work may otherwise happen by contractors. And a similar group of employees at the Department of Environmental Management to ensure that their FTE authorization allows that critical work funded by ongoing federal grants can be performed by state employees. We also have some notable additions at the Department of Administration and in Health and Human Services. With all of this, we have many projects in flight, and government is facing much uncertainty right now, so it's critical that we have the administrative positions needed in finance and planning to ensure that whether it be Medicaid challenges, the challenges of our HHS agencies, and the many projects that DOA is facing, ranging from IT infrastructure projects to being a good steward of state resources, that we have the FTE in place to manage those. And then you can see that we have a variety of transfers happening across government and positions added for critical needs in various departments. This is a condensed version of the surplus statement that is in our budget materials. I'll spare you with all the details, but it shows how funds flow from the current year into next year. And one notable takeaway from this is that you'll see the bottom line in 2024 is $8.8 million. This means that the governor's recommendation leaves $8.8 million unallocated, if you will. This is consistent with what we did last year. Last year we had about $8 million on the bottom line in the governor's recommended budget as well. And it is a reflection of the uncertainty that we're currently facing. We still have, we're still tracking down FEMA reimbursement. We're still tracking down changing expectations with respect to the unwinding of the public health emergency and Medicaid. We're still awaiting our final closing statements. So building a little bit of a buffer here acknowledges the uncertainty that we expect in the coming months and gives us some space to react and adapt to that. And then on the final slide, I'll see how long I can talk about this before I get interrupted by Brian, and I will gladly let him interrupt me. But on the 5-year forecast, you'll see we've made a couple tweaks to the presentation here to emphasize the trend that's been happening over the past couple of years. We've added an additional out year to the forecast. So the 5-year forecast is an important exercise that we do every year. It's not a crystal ball into the future, but it's an opportunity to update our assumptions about what trends are driving revenues and expenditures. It's our opportunity to see what expenditure items have an outsized impact, either savings or increase in cost in the out years. And importantly, it's a tool to see year over year how do our expectations for the future change. And notably, the story here is that since the depths of the pandemic, the May 2020 Revenue Estimating Conference, we made precipitous downward revisions to revenue expectations at that time, and we've been making very solid increases to revenue estimates since then. And hopefully, our consensus economic forecast indicates that we've likely made it through the most acute period of inflation. While we may have continued economic challenge in the next couple of quarters with respect to a potential for a recession, we may have made it through the most acute period of inflation. So with that in mind, I think some notable observations here that I'll pass it off to Brian to discuss further are, the increase in the improvement in the fiscal outlook over the past couple of years, hundreds of millions of dollars of improvement, and also the fact that in the out years, that out year deficit does still consistently appear to be improving.
Thanks, Joe. We end with this slide because I think it's probably one of the most important slides. We've been doing budgets. I think this is my 8th budget with the state. My first budget was fiscal year 2012 when Governor Chafee was first elected. We were facing about a $350 million deficit at that time. At that time, it was about 10% of the operating budget, and that was a tough budget. There were tax increases proposed. There were funding cuts that were proposed. And even after all that, looking in the 5-year forecast after we did that, the deficit kept growing. And it got up to almost 20% of the budget. This matters because this is a huge improvement in the state of Rhode Island's long-term fiscal forecast. The fact that in the past the deficit was always getting larger, now you see it's getting smaller. We actually had to flip the axis on this because we were confused, like why does it look like it's getting worse? So we're showing that the deficit's actually getting better. That happens when the revenue growth rate exceeds the expenditure growth rate. So your revenues are growing faster than your expenditures. This is why it really matters to having fiscal discipline and not spending more than we're taking in, understanding what our cost growth areas are, investing one-time dollars into one-time expenditures, and you see the benefits of that going into the out years. So I think this is a key factor. We talked about this with the governor at the beginning of the budget process. We started with a 5-year forecast and we ended with a 5-year forecast because we want to make sure that everything we were doing was improving the out-year fiscal outlook for the state. And that's happy to see this, and I'm happy to take questions. Join to the table.
Brian, the cost for the quality in abortion, what is that? And just to be clear, this is going to be included as part of the budget, correct?
Yes, it is included as part of the budget. It shows up in 2 areas in the Department of Administration. So the Department of Administration is for state employees, and for Medicaid, it is for Medicaid recipients. In the Department of HHS, our estimates are just under $30,000 is the cost of providing that coverage to state employees. And for Medicaid, it's just under $600,000. So to collectively, just about $630,000 of general revenue. We cannot use federal dollars for this to provide that coverage.
Can I ask a couple of unrelated questions? Number one, the $45 million for public-private partnerships, bioscience, does the state have any potential partners lined up for that $45 million?
That's a great question. I know that Secretary Tanner is here from the Office of Commerce. She probably has more details on that. I can say that this was consistent with the recommendations from the Rhode Island Foundation. The Rhode Island Foundation did reach out to find out what the market capacity is, to find out what the need is, and so the proposal that is the governor has put forward is consistent with those recommendations, and I'm sure Secretary Tanner after the fact could give you some more detail.
Nothing right now, just to get it. Is it possible the Secretary could stand up and perhaps answer that question?
Sorry, ask the question again?
Is anybody lined up yet or in the wings identified for the $45 million for the bioscience?
So as you know, Rhode Island RFP has their RFP out, so there are lots of conversations ongoing, but not until the decision is made by Rhode Island Energy.
Is it a physical building? Are you planning like another Wexford to put these new wet labs in?
Sorry, I confused that answer with a different project. Let me stop and think about the question that you asked. I was speaking about South Key. Your question was about Life and Bio. At this time, those conversations are happening with the trade associations. I think that answers your question. What was your question again?
Is it a physical building, or do you want to build a new building to put these wet labs in?
We're not considering a new building. We're considering working in conjunction with the growing wet lab incubator in the new health lab.
Thank you. If you're willing to bear with me for a couple of questions, and I'll shut up. Last time I wrote about the hospital tax, 150 odd million, or whatever, somebody said, ooh, that may be illegal. And I think the IRS finally caught up with what was, you could never say out loud, Shellgate with Dispro Share. So my question is, why is it in here if it's illegal?
Okay, so I'll reframe that question a little bit. So the hospital licensing fee is a fee that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we are allowed to charge hospitals a fee. It is required to be broad-based and uniform. There are some opportunities for waivers based on certain criteria. The state did come up with what we later found out was a non-compliant hospital licensing fee. I think it was about 2012. It provided a discount to South County and Westerly hospitals. The expectation was that that was compliant. It turns out CMS never signed off on that. So when CMS, within the last year and a half, said, actually you need to revisit this. So they gave us an opportunity. They were working with the Executive Office of Health and Human Services and the Medicaid agency in EOHHS. They said, we understand this may have been a mistake. You need to come into compliance. So we are proposing a change to the hospital licensing fee in the budget. We have worked very closely with the Hospital Association of Rhode Island. Our understanding is that it will meet the criteria for Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to be approved. So we do believe that the proposal that is in the budget is, we think it's going to receive approval. We are having conversations with CMS right now to make sure. If we get any feedback that something needs to be modified, we will take that back and we will amend the proposal.
When this is over, I'd be interested, so I don't hold other people up on this one point, of what the change is. I have one final question, then I'll shut up for a bit. But the pre-funded $15 million increase in the Rebuild Rhode Island cap, is that for Superman?
I do not believe there are any identified projects. The governor proposed that last year. Superman has already received funds in Rebuild. This is for other economic development initiatives. We're getting very close to that cap right now, so we want to make sure that that is available going forward. So again, the proposal is to increase it from the cap from 210 to 225 and pre-fund it. I do not believe there are any identified projects specifically for that yet.
And make use of the 1 year sunset.
Yep.
When you talked about reaching the goal of Massachusetts education levels, how does that measure? Is that test scores? Is that graduation rates? And who's going to come up with a plan to do that?
I do not want to presuppose any response for Commissioner Infante Green. I know that the governor spoke about having a 100-day plan about how that would be achieved. I think there are probably a number of different ways that would be measured. I would refer you to the Department of Ed. I don't know that maybe Commissioner after the fact could answer that for you.
As it pertains to education, you talked about the $30 million in full harmless spending. Is that included in this? Is it in addition to the $57 million proposed for K through 12? What can you kind of mark that out?
It's a good question. And education funding formula is challenging because there are a lot of moving parts. You had 5 on the screen there, and there are other parts as well. The $30 million, because money follows the student and it's an enrollment-based formula. If we were just to go back to the prior funding formula, based on the reduction in enrollment, traditional public schools would lose $30 million, period. So what we did instead is say, we're not going to hold harmless. That's what we did last year. We essentially said, well, it doesn't matter if you've lost enrollment. We're going to keep paying for those seats. The governor said, the pandemic, we're coming out of the pandemic. We need to think prospectively about how we want to target our education dollars. So rather than just paying for empty seats, we are channeling the $57 million to specific initiatives in the funding formula to assist, to increase the payment for students in poverty, to fully fund multilingual learners. So in addition, so they will not receive that $30 million hit. The net gain is actually $57.8 million across all public schools.
Gotcha. And then one more question. There was around $134,000 for a transformation specialist that would support the lowest achieving schools. Do you know yet what districts they're going to focus on?
I would have to refer you to the Department of Education. I know this has been a priority of theirs for years, so we're happy to fund that, and Commissioner, someone could follow up with you on that.
Is that something the commissioner might be willing to answer? Okay, great.
How did you land on the 15 basis point reduction in the sales tax? And what should we take away from the fact that you're not actually budgeting out for additional cuts in out years?
Yeah, if you bring up the 5-year forecast, that's a great question. So the governor kept saying, we want to make sure that we are doing sales tax relief that we can afford. He mentioned the fact that in the early 90s, the sales tax had been increased from 6 to 7. When the credit union crisis happened and DEPCO had to issue bonds, the expectation was when those bonds were paid off, the sales tax would reduce from 7 to 6%. I think the DEPCO bonds were paid off in 2002. The state got accustomed to that money. They didn't want to give it up, and so that was never reduced. A similar thing happened in 2011. Governor Chafee had proposed broadening and lowering the sales tax, but the General Assembly did not do that. They instead said if Congress passes legislation allowing sales taxation of internet sales, we will reduce our sales tax from 7% to 6.5%. The Supreme Court in 2018 had the Wayfair decision that did allow that, did allow taxation of internet sales, and the General Assembly then repealed that. What we've seen multiple times in the past is we've made promises that we can't pay for because it's really hard to give up the money when you have it. So the governor wants to make sure that we are making these decisions in light of that fiscal outlook, that we are doing what we can afford each year with a constant goal of trying to get down and equal to Massachusetts as quickly as possible.
Did you take into consideration giving out rebates or checks to Rhode Islanders directly as they did in Massachusetts instead of cutting the sales tax, or was it sales tax from the beginning?
It's sales tax. I mean, one thing that's important about sales tax, so giving out a check is one-time dollars. So if we do use some of the one-time dollars for tax relief, we have the $25 million that we're not to prevent the increase in the gas tax, the $35 million in gross receipts tax for gas and electric customers. So those are some of the one-time dollars. When you change the sales tax, this is a permanent change, and because the fact that we are out of line with our neighbors, the governor wants to make sure that we have a long-term approach to bring that down. So you could do additional support on a one-time basis, but that does not make Rhode Island more competitive in the long term. You want to make sure that we are taking steps in the long term, finding out what we can afford and reduce the sales tax each year.
Just one more.
On that, wouldn't it take years and years to actually get the rebates that Massachusetts residents are getting? Because I believe if you were making $50,000 and you spent that entire income on taxable goods, which nobody obviously does, isn't that just $75 a year?
I'm not sure of the question.
Wouldn't it take years for, if you're just focusing on the sales tax going at this rate, to get back the money to taxpayers that Massachusetts residents got in a single paycheck?
I understand. Yes. So the difference is that this is long-term tax relief, and this is about making Rhode Island businesses more competitive. As I mentioned, a third of Rhode Islanders live within 3 miles of the border. They can cross the border. They can shop in Attleboro. They can shop at Seekonk. That puts Rhode Island businesses at a disadvantage. So the long-term approach is to make sure that we become more competitive from our sales tax perspective so that we don't have to worry about people going to Massachusetts to buy large goods, and that Rhode Island retailers are competitive.
Do we know what's the cost of that sales tax change? What's the cost of that sales tax?
The sales tax, the way it is in the budget right now, would take effect on October 1st. So it is a fiscal year 24 impact of $25 million. Annualized, that's $35 million to add that fourth quarter.
Do we know that do we know that people actually, we hear anecdotal evidence that people cross the border to do shopping, but do we have any hardcore studies that show this? Is that something because I've never seen that. And I don't know what we lose. What do businesses in Rhode Island lose to Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's hard because we're a small state to model some of that, but At the very least, we just want to make sure it's not a decision, it's not a factor in people's decision, it's where they buy goods.
Okay.
On the gas tax, I think it was in this room, the governor a couple of times during the pandemic was asked why he's not suspending the gas tax like Connecticut did. His answer was, well, it'll be a couple of cents when you fill up your tank. No one really noticed. I've been to Connecticut. It's not much of a difference. And now he's spending a significant chunk of money, something that could be used to take his sales tax cut even further, on reducing the gas tax. Why?
So the gas tax is, gas prices are still, relatively high, not as high as they used to be. They have come down. We're really using one-time surplus to cover 2 years of that gas tax. When it comes to 2 years from now and the gas tax is indexed for inflation again, we can revisit it. Hopefully inflation will come down. There were years the gas tax really didn't increase at all because of the inflationary factor. So the goal is to make sure that people don't have that immediate 3-cent increase as of July 1st, particularly during the summer driving season. So we just want to make sure that we're providing tax relief in the near term, and we're using one-time dollars to cover the cost for the 2 years.
And related to climate,
related to that, there's a lot of stuff related to roads. There's both the gas tax. There's also the tax break on trucks. I don't see anything related to advancing the Act on Climate goals.
Right.
Where is the synergy there?
No, it's a great question. So the budget includes a provision similar to last year, a proposal to end the performance bonus for the utilities. That was a proposal that was done last year. It would have essentially taken the money that went to National Grid and held that back and make sure that you fund the EC4 climate initiatives. That is proposed here this year. The number is 4.5 million, recognizing that sometime in some years the amounts were not quite, the amounts that went to National Grid were not $6 million. So the number is 4.5, and that provides support for all of the EC4 efforts.
And no free RIPTA, right? There's nothing in here.
No changes on RIPTA.
We have time for 2 more.
Well, Brian, you put the $70 million to offset the truck tolls under one-time spending. That's if you win, right?
Yes, so that is for fiscal year 23 and 24. That is assuming that we have, we're not going to resume them until at least fiscal year 2025. We'll see how the court case plays out, and we will make any modifications at that time.
Have you factored in the amount of money that you could have to pay for a lawsuit for this appeal, the millions that this could cost? You've already spent, I think, $10 million.
Yeah, I'd have to check on that. I'm not sure. It's not specifically budgeted. There's probably a source for it. I'll have to get back to you.
All right, guys, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming.